In order to be an effective teacher, it's paramount to have consistent project management strategies, or classroom management strategies, excuse me. Projects are on the mind a bit. After a semester of student teaching in J.C. Harmon in Kansas City, one thing when conducting classroom projects, or when giving classroom projects to students, or essentially when just leading a classroom on a day-to-day basis, having consistent classroom management strategies was critically important. A video that resonated with me was came it was it talked about how classroom management has to be, or classroom management policies, classroom rules have to be enforced regularly. They have to be enforced on a consistent basis. You can't establish the rules and then let go of the rules, or not focus, let things slide, and not be consistent on when you enforce the classroom policy and when you don't. This especially resonated with me. I had four history classes. My second, fifth, and first hour were all phenomenal classes. Or classroom management wasn't that big of an issue. And when it was very easy for me to enforce a consistent policy. I had to give out, I think, in those classes a total of 4 detentions. But when I did, usually the behavior was corrected. That did the job of correcting the behavior after the detentions. My sixth hour, on the other hand, was a different story. That class had a lot of behavioral issues, and from the very beginning, I was in trouble because I had students who would challenge me verbally, students who would yell at me, students who would swear at me, and I got in trouble because I did not enforce. I did a poor job of enforcing the rules on a regular basis. Honestly, one of my concerns at the beginning, I don't know. Um, I was worried. I wanted to establish some kind of relationship with the students so that I could inspire these students in order to get work done, or to have students see the importance of what they were doing. When I was watching my cooperating teacher, she struggled with management too. And so I tried to shake up the strategy a little bit. Unfortunately, I was kind of making up my strategy as I went along, and this ended up causing me a lot of problems. And so one thing I noticed though was that in my other classes, because behavior wasn't a daily issue, when I enforced a consistent policy, the rules sort of took care of themselves. I never was able to establish consistency or control over my sixth hour class. And in the future, I'm going to make sure, one way I'll try to combat that is making sure that I have a set of classroom rules and that I enforce them. And why, going back to, my original thesis of classroom management, I don't think, saying that classroom management is paramount to being an effective teacher isn't saying that you have to be strict with classroom management. It's that you have to be consistent. Students inevitably throughout all of time, students have had moments of goofing around, going into Nepal, and I saw students who would goof around in the classroom. That is something that's part of being around students, of being around kids. But at the end of the day, having some semblance of, having standards for the students to live up to and being able to enforce those standards consistently is critical in order to maintaining an effective classroom. Um, let's see. So another thing that I struggled with personally, one thing that I read about classroom management. Okay, so they talked about weak consequences, and one of the issues that I struggled to grapple with throughout the semester was that there was no administrative support, or very little administrative support, um, in my experience as a student teacher. That was very difficult. If you sent if you sent kids to the office, they didn't mind. They didn't care if they went to the office. In fact, the police officer just usually sent them back. without explanation, just sort of drop them off and go elsewhere. The kids loved ISS. Wednesday school, which is when kids would have to stay 2 hours after school, there were 130 kids that had to go to Wednesday school. And so they just basically canceled Wednesday school, and the kids didn't mind Wednesday school. They kind of like sitting in a quiet place. And so there were no effective consequences. And it felt like I any consequence that I enforced was essentially a weak consequence. And that was, my consequences worked for first, second and fifth hour, because I would do with in my power. I would do what was in my power in order to enforce consequences. So detentions, or I would also take phones. In sixth hour, if I tried to take phones from some people, they would cuss me out. They wouldn't show up to my detentions. So, and if I sent them down to the office, oftentimes people in the office wouldn't even answer. So I couldn't even get someone to come up from the office to take my students who were, who had disciplinary issues. And so it felt like, there were several times where I would sit there and I, felt like at the end of the day, when students would challenge me to enforce strong consequences, I would not be able to come through with a strong consequence that would disincentivize, negative behavior, disincentivize. And this was an ongoing issue, especially for my sixth hour. I feel bad for sixth hour, but seeing this is classroom management, they're going to come up a lot. I feel like this is. I feel like another thing though that worked really well. You know, um, that really stuck out to me. I think, lastly, is talking about. Okay, so I really felt like I think it's important to open up to students in terms of your personality. At the end of the day, no matter what, I am always going to be me, and I think it's important to be human in front of students, to open yourself up. And I miss my kids. Being done with student teaching, that's been the hardest. It's been a void. I have gone back several times just to see my students, and it was because I felt like I was able to build really. I wouldn't call it friendships, but I was able to form human relationships, with my students. And I think it's important, you know, I think it's important to be human in front of students, because if you're not human, if you don't make that connection with students, um, I think it puts a barrier between you and the student. It takes out the essence of what a human relationship is, what talking to a person is, because you don't know that person. You have an artificial relationship with that person. The only commonality you have with that person is the physical space that you share. And so I think it's critical, in order to develop positive interactions with students, for the students to know who you are. And obviously there are exceptions to that, but um, I was real with my students. I talked about spina bifida. I talked about having back problems. I talked about my dreams. I talked about open world. And I felt like I saw a lot of student success. I was able to motivate a lot of students, because when I was talking to them, it felt like they were talking to a person, or that's how at least it felt like from my end. Rather than a drill sergeant. It was wanting them, to get something done. Overall, I think. At the end of the day, I think classroom management, I always knew it would be an issue. I always knew it would be a big issue and a big hurdle to overcome. But the last 2 semesters, I think, have really, I don't know, as great. The writings on classroom management are phenomenal, especially. I was always blown away by reading about phenomenons like acting white and things like that. But honestly, I think the most that I ever could have learned was from these semesters, the sort of being thrown into the fire, going from the frying pan into the fire this semester. But overall, my experiences have made me eager to get into the classroom next year. Thank you.